Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex and I'm with The Scholar. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're happy you're here and we hope you enjoy tonight's program with Martha Hall Kelly. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping to go over as always. First, we have announced many events over the next few months, but there are two events I'd like to highlight. One, we'll be hosting New York Times bestselling author Patty Callahan Henry on Wednesday, May 10th at 1 p.m. She'll be here to discuss her new novel of historical fiction, The Secret Book of Flora Lee. And two, we'll be hosting the author of the Bridgerton series, Julia Quinn, on Friday, May 12th to discuss the new Netflix series and her new novel, Queen Charlotte. Please take an events flyer up at the front as you leave and stay tuned to our social media pages, e-newsletter, and websites for announcements on upcoming events. Second, if you haven't heard, this is our second Bookstores Love Libraries event. We're happy to partner with libraries across the state to welcome some of our favorite authors to the region. What it means for you at this event, show your library card at checkout for a free coffee or tea and 10% off any purchase for the evening. Just make sure you show your library card at the beginning of the transaction and we'll get you set up with a discount. So again, a huge thank you to our local libraries for continuing to provide books and educational resources to our communities. Lastly, perhaps most importantly, we want everyone to come away with a book tonight, so we encourage you to purchase the Golden Doves through the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. Book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author events, and your purchase helps support the author and the bookstore. But now I'm happy to introduce our author this evening. Martha Hall Kelly is the New York Times bestselling author of Lilac Girls, Lost Roses, and Sunflower Sisters. With more than 2 million copies of her books sold and translated into 50 countries, she lives in Connecticut and New York City. Of course, the book that we are here for this evening is titled The Golden Doves. I've got to read just a couple blurbs. Christy Woodson Harvey calls it literary perfection, and Alison Pataki says that The Golden Doves is breathtaking, both in the beauty of its language and the twists of its high-stakes plot. We're so very honored to welcome Martha to Harrisburg for the very first time. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm Harrisburg welcome to Martha Hall Kelly.
Great. Thank you so much. I feel like I need to come out from behind the podium a little bit. So I might need to walk around a little bit. How is everybody tonight? Good? Such a gorgeous day out there. I just came from, where did I even come from? Cranston, Rhode Island. Yeah, that garden spot. But we had a launch event there last night, so it was super fun. So this is just really my first time solo talking about the book because last night was in conversation. So bear with me. It's my first time talking about the book. If you don't mind me practicing on you a little bit. So I wanted to ask first, who has read Lilac Girls, my first book? Wow. Oh, there's a couple here. I don't know. Slackers. No, I'm just kidding. I always like to ask that because I don't want to give spoilers to people that haven't read it, but also halfway through. Well, still, I don't want to tell you, too much. But it is important, I think, for me to know who's read Lilac Girls because this book kind of came out of Lilac Girls. So maybe what I'll do is just tell you a little bit about how, and I have a half an hour to talk, and then we're going to do some questions, which is always my favorite part. And then we're going to do a little signing. But so Lilac Girls, oh my goodness. Oh, the other thing is, who's read Golden Doves? One person. Wow, you're fast. Oh, you haven't read Golden Doves. So no one's read Golden Doves. Okay, it only came out yesterday. I know. But but a lot of the people at the Cranston event had read it already. Yeah, they got it that morning and they speed read. I know. Thought that was crazy. So so I'm not going to really. I'll tell you a little bit about the plot of Golden Doves. But I'm not going to tell you too much because there's a real tendency to, if you hear too much about the book and then you read it, it kind of spoils it, even if it's not like technically spoilers. Okay, so so what I wanted to do was tell you a little bit about the research that I did for Golden Doves. But first, Lilac Girls. Has anyone been to the Bellamy Faraday House and Gardens in Connecticut? No way. Oh, the lilacs were out probably. Maybe June is a little bit better. But the Bellamy Faraday House and Gardens, if you haven't read Lilac Girls, is where I found out about the story, the true story of Lilac Girls. And I was living in Fairfield, Connecticut at the time. My mom had just passed away. It was 2000. And I was so sad. It was Mother's Day, and she had been gone for maybe 6 months. And my husband said, why don't you go up and see that house you've always wanted to go see? I'll take care of the kids. And he did not have to ask me twice with the I'll take care of the kids. So I got in the car and I drove up to the Bellamy Faraday House, which was about an hour north. And it's a beautiful place, isn't it? It's this big old white clapboard house, very New England. And it was the home of Caroline Faraday. And she was a philanthropist, a socialite, an actress. And I really went up there for the lilacs because my mom loved lilacs and they collected specimen lilacs from around the world. And so, and that garden did not disappoint that day. And, but I was the only one on the tour. Now, after Lilac Girls, it's always crowded there. There's always busloads of people coming in to, kind of pay homage to Caroline, the woman that lived there. But that day it was just me. And I thought, well, I paid my $3. Now I think it's $5. I might as well go in and get the tour. And it was fine. It was about Reverend Bellamy, who had built the house. And he, it was the 1700s. I didn't get engaged until the second floor outside of Caroline's bedroom where her desk was. And they have it just as as it was when she was alive, with her big old Remington typewriter. And she was such a Francophile. She has all this French stuff. But I was drawn to a photograph of maybe 50 or so middle-aged ladies all lined up for a picture. And I asked the docent, who are those women? And she said, oh, those are the rabbits. They were women that Polish Catholic women who during World War II, they were operated on by the Nazis at Ravensbrück concentration camp, Hitler's only all-female concentration camp. And their legs were opened up and they experimented on them with sulfa drugs to see the efficacy against gangrene. So 74 of these girls, the youngest of which was 14, they were Girl Scouts in Poland when they were arrested. And Himmler just said, I think they would be, they have the healthiest legs, so let's operate on them. So Caroline, when she found out about these women from her French friend, Geneviève de Gaulle, who was de Gaulle's niece, who had been at the concentration camp with these women, Geneviève came to Caroline and said, would you help them? And she said, absolutely. And so she went and brought them out from behind the Iron Curtain. They were in communist Poland after the war, the ones that survived. They could barely walk, most of them. And she brought them to this country for rehabilitation and the trip of a lifetime. Now, you know that if you have read Lilac Girls. But I just thought that would bear repeating because that's the genesis of everything. So when that book came out, and I went to Ravensbrück twice. I went once with my son. I bribed him to come with me. I said, you can have one beer. And he said, okay. He got excited about it. And I said, Polish women are beautiful. And he was like, okay. He really got very excited after that. So we went together to Ravensbrück, and I did not win Mother of the Year because he was my videographer and I was kind of pushing him. And at one point he said, Mom, I have to just sit down because it's hard being there. As you can imagine, the crematoria is still there. A lot of the blocks have been taken down. So it's just this like vast plots. But I came back from that trip and I thought I can now write the characters of Herta, the, horrible doctor, German doctor, the only female doctor at the all-female camp. And Kasia, who was the Polish, kind of a composite of all the rabbits. So I came back, wrote Lilac Girls, and in paperback, it became just, I don't know, it sold like 2 million copies now or something. It's crazy. So when that happened, I said, I'm going to write 2 more books. So I went back in time with Caroline's family, and that was Lost Roses about her mother, and then Sunflower Sisters, which actually takes place in Gettysburg. So so that was the genesis of that. But while I was down on a Jewish book tour, actually in Florida for Lilac Girls, I was introduced by someone, and her name was Irene Zitzblatz. And she was a Holocaust survivor. That's all I knew about her. And when she gave her introduction, I just thought, why is anyone here to listen to me? Because her story was so shocking and so terrible. And I always thought I want to write about that at some point when I circle back to World War II. And her story was, she was on the platform at Auschwitz with her mother, having arrived there, holding her little sister's hand, and her mother was holding her little brother's hand. And the mother had blue eyes. And so Joseph Mengele came to the mother and said, come with me and leave your children here. And the mother said, I'm not leaving my children. And he said, fine, I'm taking your daughter. And that was Irene when she was 8 years old. She had green eyes. So he took his baton and he hit their hands because she was holding the little sister's hand. And he took Irene, and the mom had her swallow 4 diamonds on the platform. And the mom said, I will find you, don't worry. So she went, and later that night, she went to the door of the block, and the wardress said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm looking for my mother. And she said, your mother isn't coming back. She's up there. And she pointed to the chimney. And Irene tells this story in such a kind of plain way, without any kind of, she's not a victim. She's really come a long way. And so that night we sat in the parking lot of my hotel. Her daughter was driving me back to the hotel, and Irene was in the car, and she talked for 2 hours about Mengele. And I just thought, oh my God, why was he not caught? What happened? So that led me down a path where I found out a lot about the Germans that escaped, the fugitive Nazis that escaped after World War II. And I found out why Mengele was not caught, and also how so many other fugitive Nazis made it down and out of the country through the rat line. And I'm sure a lot of you already know about the rat line, but at the time, I didn't know much about it at all. And what they did was they went from Germany down over the Bremer Pass, through northern Italy, all the way down to Rome, where they would wait to get their transit papers and earn money. A lot of them actually worked in the movie business, in movies. And there are a couple of Italian movies where you can actually see fugitive Nazis. And they also wrote screenplays, and they were helped. I'm Catholic, and when I found out that the Catholic Church helped the Nazis escape on the rat line, I was blown away. And I thought, that is something that I want to include in this book. So this story, The Golden Doves, has a lot of the things that I wanted to include in Lilac Girls, but it wasn't germane to the story. And another thing was the Kinderzimmer at Ravensbrück. It was a special block where the Nazis held the expectant mothers and the mothers with young children, because they found that the moms were not productive workers if they took their children away from them. And so this was an experiment that they did to see if the moms, if they lived with the children, could be more productive workers. But sadly, they didn't feed the babies, and all the children died in the Kinderzimmer. So when I found out about that at Ravensbrück, I wanted to include that in a novel too. And so that's what I did. And The Golden Doves is a product of that. It's about two women, and I should hold the book up and show you. One is Josie. Josie is over here in the left, and she's an American, and Arlette is French. And I found another thing I found at Ravensbrück was that there were a lot of Americans there, which I found surprising. There were 6 or 7 Americans. One was Fiorello LaGuardia's sister was at the camp, and many, 6 others that were Americans. So I thought, I want to have my Josie be Jewish, or at least her mother is Jewish, and she ends up at the camp, but no one knows she's Jewish. And then Arlette is, she is from Alsace, which is half German, it's right on the border of France. So she identifies as German. She was in the BDM, which is the female wing of the Hitler Youth. And she has a baby out of wedlock with a German Wehrmacht soldier. And he is, she has it at a Lebensborn home. So I knew those were the characters that I wanted to have. And I thought, well, what can possibly happen? And so I set Josie years later, after they survive Ravensbrück, and I can't tell you too much about, the specifics of that, but later, Josie is working at Fort Bliss, Texas, in Army intelligence, and she is searching she's working for Operation Paperclip. I don't know if you know about Operation Paperclip. It was the secret program that the Germans used, or that the Americans used, to bring over German scientists after the war. They were competing with Russia, USSR, to the Soviets to get the best scientists, so that they could, it was the beginning of the Cold War, so that they could use those scientists and, defeat Russia. So in my book, Josie is working for US intelligence, and she's vetting those scientists, because what they would do is clean up their resumes and then send them to the United States and act like, oh, well, they were just farmers, or they weren't real Nazis. And they sent over 1,000 of these scientists over. And in the book, Josie is just waiting, because she's vetting the scientists as they come, but she's looking for a scientist that this Dr. Snow, that did terrible things to her mother at the camp, and Arlette's baby that disappears, and no one knows, and they think Dr. Snow had something to do with it. So that in current day is where we see Josie. And Arlette, meanwhile, is working at a French cafe in Paris, terribly, bruised, and still hasn't recovered from having her child taken away from her at Ravensbrück. And then a man comes to the cafe and says, I think I know where your son is. And she has to decide. He says, he has an orphanage in South America, and she has to decide if she, there were a lot after the war of people that kind of took advantage of survivors. So she thinks, is this on the up and up? So she has to decide if she goes and, tries to find her son. So that's the setup at the beginning. And one other true part of the story that I thought you might be interested in is when I first started writing Lilac Girls, a friend of mine, Stafford Cohen, he's in his 90s now, he's a former cardiologist at Beth Israel Hospital. He became very interested because a lot of the rabbits came to Beth Israel and to get their surgeries done, the corrective surgeries. And he said, that he had found information about one of the real rabbits, and her name was Nina Ivanska. And that got my attention because that's who I based Kasha on in Lilac Girls. And he said, Nina Ivanska, when she was here talking to Caroline Faraday, she was helped by all these doctors at Beth Israel, and they came to her with a magazine, a medical magazine, a journal. And in it was a man named Walter Schreiber, and he had been the chief hygiene officer in the SS during the war, and the Surgeon General, basically, and head doctor. And in this medical journal, they had a photograph of him, and it was the Army talking about how he was this great guy and he had come over from Germany and really didn't do anything during the war, just helped people. And they showed her the picture and they said, "Did you know Walter Schreiber? Did he have anything to do with your operations?" And she said, yes, he was the head of it. He would come around at Ravensbrück, and they called it the Great Marveling. And, you know, these women had been so horribly mutilated, and they only had paper bandages to you know, help them. And she said that Walter Schreiber would come around, and of course they didn't use their real names, but everybody knew who they were. The girls knew for sure, just because they didn't think the Poles could speak German, but of course they did. So they heard everything. And she said he was in charge of our medical experiments. And meanwhile, Dr. Gebhardt, who, you know, was under Schreiber, had been executed after Nuremberg because they said he did such terrible things to these girls. And this was his boss. So she said, how could this be happening? You know, it really freaked her out. So the doctors helped her go to the FBI and the Boston Globe, and they broke the story. And after that, the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Truman, or Truman under them, really, they didn't know what to do because the United States, you know, everybody in the country was saying, how could you do this? They're Nazis. They, you know, they were outraged. So very quietly, they took Walter Schreiber and they put him on a boat and they sent him down to South America to live with his daughter in a house that she named Without a Care. And he lived the rest of his life perfectly, you know, fine and happy down in South America. So the US government did nothing about it. So that is a little backstory, because in the book, the real Nina Ivanska appears. And so now you kind of know the backstory about what happens with her. And one last real bit of information I wanted to give you before we open it up to questions is after the rat line started, the fugitive Nazis would come down through northern Italy. They were helped by the Catholic Church by, as they went, there were safe houses, monasteries, where they would dress these fugitive Nazis as monks, and they would live there undercover until they had enough money for them and transit papers to move on. Some went through Genoa to South America on boats, but a lot of them continued down to Rome. And one man who helped them the most was named Bishop Udall. And he was called the Brown Bishop because he was Austrian and he hated communists. And he felt like his boys, these fugitive Nazis, who were Germans and Austrians, they really didn't deserve to be in jail. And so he spent much of his adult life freeing them and making sure that they got away and never had to pay for their crimes. And even in Rome, some of them lived in an orphanage, and that's where they made those movies, and they taught children at the orphanage. They were teachers. So my husband and I went, as soon as COVID was lifted, the travel restrictions, we went to Italy and we traced the route line. We started at the Bremer Pass, up over the border, and then we came down, and Bolzano is a town where a lot of them just lived and were fine after the war. Nobody bothered them. So we went from Bolzano and then took the train that they all took down to Rome. And we thought, why don't we go over to this, over to the Vatican and look in this German cemetery, because right next to it, they had a building where they had hidden a lot of Nazis. And I thought, I want to see it for myself. And this is all in recently declassified 1990s declassified CAA documents. So it's not like my opinion, it's the truth. And so once we got in there, I got to see, this place where they kept the Nazis, my husband said, there's a line over there of people and they're all going to the German cemetery. And we felt like we were in the Da Vinci Code or something. And he said, my grandfather was German, and, I can say that I'm going to see my grandfather or something, if anyone even asks. So, they had all the Swiss guards and everything. And so we got into the line and we thought, this, they're not going to let us in. This is crazy. And all of a sudden they were like, oh, okay, who's here for the German cemetery? And they waved us in to Vatican City behind the gates. And we were just like, oh my God, this is crazy. And we went into my husband, of course, was trying to like wander a little bit and look around the back, and they were like, no, you can only go in the cemetery. So we walked around in there and I thought, and it's actually very beautiful. It's all palm trees, and they have all the stations of the cross. And, there's someone buried under each station of the cross. And I thought, well, there's no way Bishop Udel's buried in here, because he was such a real black mark for the Vatican. And there are all sorts of speculation, like, did the Pope know that he was doing it? He was pretty open about doing it. So my husband and I were flipping through the pages, because they had these like plasticized pages of who's buried where. And my husband came to me and said, look who's buried here. And I said, not Bishop Udel. And he said, yes, let's go find him, because they have numbers. So we looked and looked, and then, we were looking in the ground, because they have some people buried in the ground. And then we came to one of the stations of the cross, and Mike went, oh, there he is. And that's where Bishop Udel was buried, under the Station of the Cross of the Good Samaritan. I know. That's how that was my reaction. We both just went, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. And we both just went, oh my God, how is that possible? I mean, whoever was in charge of that, felt like he was a good guy for letting all those Nazis go. But anyway, thank you for bearing with me during all of my backstory for the book. But I think once you read the book, it'll be really helpful. So that's my little talk. Does anybody have any questions?
First, can we give it up for Martha?
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you.
If you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with a mic.
I'm reading a historical fiction book about Italy right now. And I don't know if you have found any in your research that the Catholic Church also helped Jewish people escape and get to safety.
Absolutely.
So they weren't all bad.
Absolutely. Yeah, I should say that. And there are people like Father Flattery that, an Irish priest that helped a lot of people. My own uncle was shot down in the war. He was a ball turret gunner, which is really a dangerous thing. And he was shot down over Messina, Italy, and Catholic nuns saved his life. So, I mean, absolutely. I think Bishop Udel was, an anomaly. I mean, there was another bishop with him, Draganovich, who was Ukrainian, who also, did very similar things for a lot of the Nazis that, were further east. So I just think it's important to make sure that people know that that happened, because I know it's a cliche, but it happens again if you don't shed light on it. Yeah, but thanks for bringing that up.
Other questions?
Anybody else?
Hi, Martha.
Hi.
I'm Alexandria. I was curious, how do you pick your names for your characters? Is it like choosing a baby name? Like a name is a big deal. And so I was just curious how you go about that.
Wow. Are you a writer?
Oh, I
No.
wish.
Well, not yet. You have a lot of time that you could become a writer. I just started at 50, so you've got a lot of time. But that, no one's ever asked me that before. That's such a great question. It isn't quite like a baby name because, that baby name, they have it forever. So, I mean, this is sometimes I just pick it out of thin air. Sometimes I have a lot of old books of the period, and I'll look through those. Like I've had telephone books that I just go through. I'm writing a book now about Martha's Vineyard during World War II. So I have a lot of old Martha's Vineyard books. So I'll look through, and, it's much better to find them like that because it feels real versus me just coming up with, Ichabod, and it's, doesn't fit. But yeah, with this, I had actually named Josie something else. And at the very last minute, my publisher said, there's another book out that has that name in it. So can you change it? And I was like, okay. And I actually really like Josie because she's Jewish and she's named after her grandfather. And yeah, Joseph. So, but with Arlette, that name was difficult because my agent said, you can't just pick a French name. I mean, in France, they like you can't name your child Apple. It has to be like a real name. And so my hairstylist, I was talking to him about it, and he's like, what about Halette? And then it turned into Arlette. Yeah, so it sometimes, does that. And then my French publisher, her name is Danae. And so I thought, okay, I know she's a real French person. I'm going to use that name. And I forgot to tell her. And when when she read the manuscript, her name is in there. And she was like, oh, I was a little surprised by that. And you'll see why she was surprised, because that Danae character, if you read the book. But thank you for that question, that very original question. Yes.
Yes. Hold on, over here first then.
Oh, sorry. We'll get back to you.
I just was curious, do you have an outline for your whole story before you start writing, or is it one of those things that it gets created as you write?
A little of both. With that's such a great question. With Lilac Girls, I didn't have an outline, and it took me 10 years to write. And that's why, because I kept writing things and then going, oh, and my husband, who was a history major in college, would say, I thought Hitler wasn't there at what are you doing? So, with historical fiction, especially, and I never thought anyone would read Lilac Girls anyway, swear to God. I just thought, oh, I'm going to write this for me. And then when it did get published, I was like, uh-oh, I bet I didn't really take this seriously, because there are some scenes in there that, I don't know, if my mother was still alive, I probably wouldn't have, included them. But yeah, I realized, I kind of taught myself how to write. So I realized, because I never took a creative writing class in college. What a waste. I wish I had. But once I realized, oh, most writers, a lot of them, they call them either pantsers or planners. And I was being a pants by the seat of my pants. But I soon realized that the key to happiness, for me anyway, was a really good outline. And then I started doing, like, I would take giant pieces of like newsprint on a roll and put them like across the floor of my office, and in pencil plot out each character so that, it was, God, now that I think about it, crazy. And I still do it. Yeah. With my latest book, I've got it all outlined. But I do feel like you definitely have to know how it starts and how it ends, because otherwise it just rambles and it becomes like a weedy mess. And so, yeah, the outline is key. Thank you for that. That was such a great question. Hi, sorry, I thought you worked here
Oh.
earlier.
No, I wish I did. I'm a little far though.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
they may be looking.
Yeah. So what brought you to the path of becoming a writer? Especially you weren't a writer in your 20s, apparently.
No, you know, that's a great question. I kind of skipped over that part. I I got 2 journalism degrees, and I think my parents thought I was going to be like Barbara Walters or something, but that didn't happen. Thank God. And I became an advertising copywriter, writing TV commercials and print ads, because I watched way too much TV as a kid. It's really bad. We were talking at the last event about like the actual ad commercials that I wrote. They were so bad, like for Uncle Ben's rice and terrible salad dressing commercials. And I always wanted to put continuing characters in them. You know, I should have known. And the clients were always like, no, we don't do that. You know, this is one commercial. Like I would give the captain, remember the riverboat captain from Uncle Ben's? I gave him a girlfriend, Pearl. Somebody at the event was like, oh my God, I remember that commercial. But, you know, they always bring the wrong rice. So Pearl brings the wrong rice and he, you know, gets mad at her because she doesn't have Uncle Ben's. But that was my way of like creating a story, I guess. And I should have known then that, you know, that was happening. But then I retired. I had my 3rd child, the son that I brought with me to Ravensbrück. But when he was little, he kicked the slats out of his crib and walked out. I think I left him in there for too long in the crib. He was 8. Is that too old to be in a crib? But he was a handful as a kid, and my 3 kids all were very active. And I thought, you know what? I need to stay home with these kids. It's cruel to do this to a babysitter. And so I thought, okay, my career's over. And it pretty much was. And my husband was the CEO of the Weather Channel for a while. And he was he had a high-powered job. He had to travel. And so I was, I had accepted my fate as mom. And not that it was a bad thing. I played tennis and I enjoyed it. But then that day when I went up to the Bellamy Faraday house, and I don't know what happened. I think Caroline Faraday just inhabited me or something. And sometimes I think she just kind of looked at me and went, oh, she's as good as anyone to tell the story. Not great, not my first choice, because she was very, if you read Lilac Girls, she was very imperious. She had been dressed by maids until she was 16 years old. So, she was everyone in that town, which I live close by there now, they have so many stories about Caroline and how, they would all hide in their houses when they heard she was out driving, because she had never learned to really drive. And she had this giant green convertible car, and she would kind of, get distracted and start going off the side of the road and almost hit people. So yeah, she was pretty incredible. But anyway, back to your question. So I think by the time I went up to that house, I had been retired for a long time, and I was in my 50s. My kids were, getting a little bit older. So I think it was just the right time. I think it just shows that it's never too late for a second act. I think you just have to look out for it, because I could easily have just not gone into that house or haven't not really paid attention, which usually is my mode. But that day, I don't know, something happened to me. Still, when I walk into that house, I feel her presence. Definitely. Yeah, it's in a good way. I went to a psychic down in Atlanta, a really good one. And I think she told me a lot of really true stuff. But she said, oh, I've got a very tall, very forceful woman coming through. And I was like, oh my God. And she said, oh, and she's doing this. She was clapping. And I just thought, oh my God, it's Caroline. I hope. I mean, I think. And she was with, according to the psychic, 9 smaller women. And I thought, oh my God, I wonder if they were they're so-called rabbits, these Polish women. And she said, they're doing this to their necks. And I said, oh, I guess it's not, because, you know, it's their legs that was so bad. And she said, no, they're doing this, that they had been murdered. And 9 girls that were executed by the camp staff at the shooting wall, 9 exactly. Yeah. And she said they're telling me that they used to like to dance and they couldn't do that anymore after they were operated on. So anyway, enough of my psychic stuff, but that is, yeah, crazy.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
So when you're writing a character who's based on a real person like Caroline Faraday,
Yeah.
Faraday, how do you think about, like, are you just like imagining what this real person was like and just bringing them to life, or are you adding to them? Like, how do you develop them? Because they're so powerful. Like, I remember so many of the characters from your books, and I'm just
Oh,
curious
thank
how
you.
you make that happen.
Another fabulous question that I've never been asked. You know, with Caroline, it was easy-ish because I had studied her. There's, if you ever do go to the house, under the Welcome Center, there is a old root cellar, and that's where they keep all of her books and papers and everything. And when I first went up there, that was just a real root cellar, like with actual like rocks on the wall. And I would go down there and just look through her rose books, and she had the most amazing stuff. And all of her pictures of her great grandmother, and you know, during the Civil War, they were nurses on the battlefield at Gettysburg. So I was really curious about that. So I used to just go down there and hang out. I never told anybody because I thought they were going to think I'm a huge weirdo, because this woman died in the 90s and I'm like picking through her things. But yeah, so I knew her really well, right down to her dry cleaning where she picked it up, you know, because it's in my neighborhood. So I knew her really well, but I was afraid at first when I mean, the way that I started writing is this woman that I went out to dinner with her and her husband, and we just got talking about it. And I told her about the rabbits, and she said, oh, I have a new Polish daughter-in-law, and you know, this would make a great novel. Did Mike tell you I'm a book editor? And I just said, no, he did not tell me that. But I hadn't even thought about writing a book. And she said, all I need is a chapter. And so that's how I got, you know, writing it. And then I went to Starbucks, and I asked for a decaf cappuccino grande, and by mistake, the barista gave me a caffeinated one. And I went home, and it all just like Lilac Girls just started coming out. It was crazy, not in, you know, a perfect form, and kind of, you know, bad, but you know, a good enough first draft. So so yeah, I feel like Caroline, I had already kind of like embodied her. I know it's crazy. It's almost like an actor, that you become that person, and you become even the bad ones like Herta Oberhauser. And my son, I picked him up at school, and he was like, Mom, have you been writing Herta chapters? And I said, yes, I have. You know, I was a little crabby, maybe. Yes, very crabby. But so, yeah, I think it's like method acting in a way. But yeah, the same thing with the Golden Doves. I did, and it evolves as you're going, as you were saying. I don't just have it all locked and loaded up front. I think, ooh, what would it be like if she had a baby by a German Wehrmacht officer? How would that go? And sometimes I try it out, and it informs their personality. So anyway, yes, thank you for that.
Other questions?
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your path to publication. You kind of already scratched the surface a little bit. And then if you have any advice for people who are querying or writing historical
Which might be
fiction.
you.
Possibly. Yes.
Okay. Or a friend.
Yes.
Yes.
A friend.
You know, usually when I just talk about Lilac Girls, that I do tell that story. So, and I think it's interesting because before I started querying and getting into the publishing process, I had no idea. I thought, oh, you can only write a book if you're like James Patterson or you get an MFA and that is really not true. I mean, I'm living proof of that because I do not have an MFA, but I've read, you know, a million how to write a novel books. So I feel like I have, you know, some of the best teachers and a million World War II books. But my path to publication, I mean, once that story happened, once I started writing for this woman, Betty Sargent, who was an editor, I would just send her chapters. And eventually you know, the book was written, you know, it took a really long time, but my husband came into my office in Atlanta and he said, I think it's time you send this out. And I said, oh, what? No, because I knew from looking online, it's really, really hard to get an agent. A literary agent is what you have to have because very, like a teeny amount of people go direct to publisher to get published. So I thought, you know, okay, now it's going to be sad because I'm going to query and no one's going to want it. So having been a copywriter, that is one thing I knew how to do is write like a sales blurb about what this was. And I thought, yeah, you know, that's a really, you know, badass query. And, you know, it's only like 3 sentences. And so right before Christmas, is when my husband came to me and said, can you please just send this out? Because I was, you know, like editing like crazy. And so I'd still be editing if he hadn't said, you know, send it out. Thank God he did. And I said, well, it says on the websites that you shouldn't query before the holidays because all the agents leave. And that is true. Everyone in publishing like decamps for the holidays in like October. So by December, you know, there's really nobody there. So I sent my queries and I got it's so wonderful to like tell the story because it was so fun. I got a phone call and, you know, they never call. Even my current agent like really avoids talking to me, but maybe it's just me. Maybe I should feel bad, but I think it's in general, you know, they just would rather like send an email. If it's good news, they call. So this phone call comes and it was a woman that said, I just read Lilac Girls and I am here at my husband's bedside. He just had open heart surgery and she was still kind of crying. And she said, I just finished it and I want to represent you. And I was like, how's your husband? Is everything okay? And I said, wow, you know, great. And she sent me a contract, but it was over the holidays. And my husband's lawyer from the, you know, an entertainment lawyer from the Weather Channel, it was the Jewish holidays and he couldn't really get to it. So by the time he did, after the holidays, I had sent out 5 queries. I had gotten 4 offers. It was crazy. I just thought, this is not how they describe it on the website. So I didn't go with that original agent because my agent that I currently have said to me, I will represent you, but you have to go back and change the Herta character, the bad doctor, because I had made her really cliched. And I mean, I didn't really know how to write a book. So I had made her really cliche. So I took a year. She said, take a year and go back. And she said, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And since I was 14 years old, I've wondered why did they do this to the Jews? And you need to show me that even though these are Catholic women, why did they do this to these women? And I thought, you know what? I have offers to publish right now, but I think she's right. I'm going to go back and redo. And it was a big, you know, it was a big overhaul. And so I really dug into National Socialism in the female side and the BDM and all of that. And I came back a year later and I thought, you know, I had no contract. And I thought, oh, is she going to even remember me? And she read it and pretty quickly. And she said, okay, we're going to go out wide. And I was like, what does that even mean? I tried to pretend that I knew what it meant, but I Googled it, and it means, you know, they're going to send it to a lot of publishers. Versus I think like now they just give it to my publisher, but they don't go right. So they did that. And I thought, am I just like on another planet? This is so weird. And they sent it out, excuse me, on a Thursday. And she said, and she knew me well by then, because I get kind of anxious sometimes. And she said, now don't worry if you don't hear anything tomorrow, because it takes a while to read a book. And I was like, okay. But secretly I thought, if they really like it, you know, we'll hear back. So nothing on Friday, nothing, you know, I realize now no one works on the weekends, but by Monday, my agent called and I was in my bathrobe watching the Today Show in our apartment in New York City. And she said, are you sitting down? And I was like, I can be, because that's always good. And she said, we have our first offer. And I said, take it, because trust me, take it. And she was laughing. She's like, no, we're going to have an auction, blah, blah, blah. I was like, auction, okay. But, you know, because she had told me she had never not sold a manuscript for under a certain amount of money. And so that she had never been told, had been turned down. And I thought, please God, I don't want to be the one that is like turned down. So I was like, just take it. And she's like, no. So it went to auction that week, and I got to talk to all three of the like highest bidders, and I chose my person. Yeah. And so that was amazing. And but totally unexpected. And I, honest to God, when I was writing it, I really didn't think anyone would care. But yeah, it turns out they did. And then they changed the name of the book, which kind of like freaked me out. But it was called The Ravensbrück originally. And everybody that I talked to, they were like, well, we may need to change the title. I was like, how could that be? It's such a perfect title. But then they retitled it Lilac Girls. At the time, I was like, oh, so bad. And that because I, at lunch, told my editor, I'm trying to grow a lilac here in Atlanta. And I can't, because they need a harsh winter in order to bloom. And she said, oh, Lilac Girls, that's like the girls. They had to have a harsh winter before they could, you know, come out the other side of it. And I was like, okay, fine. And now, of course, thank God they retitled it. But anyway, I've kept you all too long. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And if you want a book signed, I'm here. Thank you.